Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The air in the churchyard was thick with perfume, laughter, and whispered gossip, but Chinaza barely noticed. The blinding white of her wedding gown, which had once made her heart race with joy when she tried it on in front of the mirror weeks ago, now felt like a costume, a cruel disguise for a woman on the edge of breaking. The black Mercedes parked at the steps should have been her chariot into a new life with her husband. Yet, as she stood there smiling mechanically for the photographer, Oena casually opened the front passenger door and gestured for Vanessa to get in. "Sit here," he said, his voice warm and indulgent, the way a man might speak to his lover. Chinaza froze for half a second, expecting him to turn to her with the same warmth, but instead, he opened the rear door for her as though she were a driver's errand. The murmurs from guests started immediately. Some tried to hide their shock. Some exchanged knowing glances, while others shamelessly recorded the scene on their phones. Her hand trembled as she gathered the heavy folds of her gown and slid into the back seat, her smile still plastered in place. Vanessa, dressed in a slim-fitting wine gown that hugged her curves, adjusted her hair and crossed her legs, looking for all the world like the real bride. And Oena, leaned slightly toward her, whispering something that made her throw back her head and laugh, the sound slicing through Chinaza's chest like a blade. As the car pulled away, Chinaza stared out of the tinted window, willing herself not to blink so the tears burning her eyes wouldn't fall. She could see their reflections in the glass, Oena's confident grin, Vanessa's deliberate little touches on his arm, and it felt like she was watching strangers. The hum of the car was a low, steady rhythm beneath the thudding in her ears. It was supposed to be their day, a day her late parents would have been proud of, a day that should have sealed the years she had poured into this man's life, standing by him when there was nothing to stand on. Yet here she was, sitting behind them like an afterthought, while the woman who had inserted herself into their lives, the one he had once casually referred to as his cousin, took the seat of honor. Chinaza's hands tightened into fists on her lap, but her face remained calm, the practiced mask of a woman who had learned that screaming only made her look crazy, while the person hurting her smiled like an angel. By the time they reached the reception hall, the whispers had thickened into something uglier. Guests who didn't know her history assumed she was some timid, unimportant wife Oena had married out of obligation. Those who did know could hardly believe the boldness of his public display. The driver opened the back door for her, and she stepped out gracefully, her chin lifted despite the humiliation pressing on her like a physical weight. Oena didn't offer her his arm. Instead, he circled the car to open Vanessa's door, his hand lingering on her waist as they walked toward the hall. Cameras flashed again, catching the three of them in a frame that would spread through social media before the night was over. Inside, the scent of roasted meats and fresh flowers couldn't disguise the bitter taste in Chinaza's mouth. She told herself she could survive this moment, just as she had survived countless smaller humiliations before. But deep in her bones, something whispered that this was not just another moment. This was the one she would never forget. The reception hall was a swirl of color and sound, glittering fabrics, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter. But under it all was an undercurrent of sharp whispers that seemed to follow Chinaza wherever she moved. As she made her way to the head table, she could feel eyes on her, some pitying, others mocking, and more than a few curious. Vanessa had taken the seat beside Oena, leaning into him with practiced ease, her manicured fingers brushing his shoulder whenever she spoke. Chinaza's designated seat was to his other side, but she might as well have been sitting in a different room. Each time she tried to join the conversation, Vanessa spoke over her or turned to Oena with a question, drawing his full attention. The MC cracked jokes about three being a crowd, earning forced laughter from the guests, but every punchline seemed to land squarely on her chest. She kept her smile in place, nodding when addressed, sipping water to keep from choking on her own shame. In the corners of the room, small clusters of women whispered, their eyes darting toward her like arrows. One of her distant cousins approached during a lull in the program, pressing her hand in silent sympathy. But Chinaza simply squeezed back and let go. She didn't want pity. Not here. Not today. She wanted to disappear into a place where no one could see her pain or measure the tremor in her voice. But every toast, every dance, every camera flash seemed designed to spotlight the reality she could not hide, that her husband had claimed another woman in front of her, and she was enduring it. Even Oena, Oena's best friend and best man, looked unsettled as he watched the interactions, his smile not quite reaching his eyes whenever Vanessa laughed too loudly at something Oena said. He had been watching her, really watching her, since the church, and she could sense the unspoken question in his gaze. How much will you take before you break? The night dragged on, each minute stretching into hours. When the cake was cut, Vanessa's hand covered Oena's, guiding the knife, as though they were the couple of the hour. Chinaza stood to the side, her own hand resting lightly on the tablecloth, her nails pressing into the fabric. She could hear the photographers snapping away, capturing the scene for posterity, an album of shame she would never open. When the final dance was called, Oena pulled Vanessa to the floor, spinning her in slow, exaggerated turns, his eyes never leaving hers. Chinaza sat at the table, her legs crossed neatly, her face serene, her heart screaming. Somewhere between the clinking of champagne glasses and the fading of the music, she decided that if this was what her life had become, she would need to remember how she got here. Every choice, every sacrifice, every moment she convinced herself to stay. And so, as the hall emptied and the chatter dimmed, she let her mind drift back to the very beginning. It had been an ordinary afternoon in ABA's bustling market, the air heavy with the scent of fried plantain and diesel fumes. Chinaza had been working at her aunt's provision shop, stacking crates of malt drinks, when a voice behind her said, "You look like you could use a hand with that." Turning, she found herself staring at a tall, lean man with warm brown eyes and a smile that could melt ice. His clothes were clean but worn, the shirt faded from too many washes, the shoes polished despite their age. There was a humility in his posture, but also a spark, a quiet confidence that seemed out of place for someone who admitted, within minutes of conversation, that he was still hustling to find his big break. That was Oena. He made her laugh easily, teasing her about her serious expression, then lowering his voice to confess he had been watching her for weeks, whenever he passed the shop. She blushed, pretending to be annoyed, but something about his honesty drew her in. Over the weeks that followed, he returned often, buying small items just to have an excuse to talk. He spoke of big dreams, owning a transport company, building a house for his mother, traveling to Dubai. His words painted vivid pictures, and in those moments, Chinaza could almost see herself there with him. He told her he didn't have much now, but if she gave him a chance, he would make her proud. And she believed him. She had always been cautious with men, but Oena's persistence was different. Not the crude persistence of men who only wanted her body, but the steady, deliberate attention of someone who seemed to be building something real. She didn't know then that the foundation he was laying was not as solid as it appeared. By the time they became a couple, Chinaza had already begun to invest herself in his journey. She introduced him to her aunt, defended him when relatives asked why she was wasting time with a man who had nothing, and encouraged him when he grew frustrated with his slow progress. They would sit on the balcony of her aunt's flat at night, sharing roasted corn and groundnuts, talking about the future as though it were a certainty. "One day," he would say, looking at her with an intensity that made her chest ache, "you'll be glad you chose me over anyone else." And each time she nodded, because she wanted that day to come, so much so that she never imagined it might arrive in a form she would come to regret. When Chinaza thought back on the early days, it wasn't the romance that stood out most, it was the grind. The endless evenings she spent counting coins with him, scribbling numbers on the back of old receipts as they planned and replanned his business ideas. She could still see them sitting on the bare cement floor of his one-room apartment, the light from a flickering bulb casting shadows on the wall, their voices low and urgent. Oena was a man of big visions but empty pockets, and she, young and hopeful, believed that her role was to fill the gap until those visions became reality. She took extra shifts at the provision shop, skipped buying new clothes for herself, and even sold the delicate gold bangles her late mother had given her as a graduation gift just so she could hand him the cash he needed to register his transport license. The day she gave him that envelope, his eyes had softened with gratitude, his arms pulling her close as he whispered, "I'll never forget this, Naza. You're my backbone." Those words wrapped themselves around her heart like silk, convincing her that every sacrifice was an investment in a future they were building together. But the sacrifices weren't only financial. They were emotional, physical, and deeply personal. When Oena's first small venture, a tricycle business, collapsed after his driver disappeared with the earnings, it was Chinaza who held him as he paced the room in frustration. When his landlord threatened eviction, it was Chinaza who quietly went to her aunt to borrow money under the guise of needing it for shop repairs. She became used to putting out the fires in his life before they consumed him, telling herself that's what love meant. Friends began to tease her, saying she was acting like a wife already, taking on burdens that weren't hers yet. She would laugh it off, claiming that she knew what she was doing, that Oena was worth the effort. Deep down, she wore her sacrifices like invisible medals, proof that she was the kind of woman a man could count on when life turned hard. The truth, which he couldn't see then, was that the balance of their relationship had shifted long before either of them acknowledged it. She had become the steady foundation, the silent investor, the one whose dreams were put on hold so his could flourish. When he finally managed to buy 2 second-hand buses and hire drivers, he stood in the doorway of her aunt's shop one evening, grinning like a man who had conquered the world. "We're getting there, my love," he said, kissing her forehead. She smiled back, proud and relieved. In that moment, it felt like every sacrifice had been worth it. What she didn't realize was that success, when it came, would not cement his gratitude. It would loosen it. And soon, the man who once called her his backbone would begin to treat her like the weakest part of his life. Oena's small successes began to snowball. The buses multiplied, routes expanded, and before long, he was hiring more staff and talking about opening a spare part shop on the side. Money began to flow in ways it never had before, and with it came new clothes, a better apartment, and invitations to gatherings Chinaza had never been part of. At first, she didn't mind being left out. She told herself it was work-related, that she didn't need to be in every space he occupied. But the silences between them began to stretch, conversations became shorter, and his once eager updates about his day became vague replies like, "You wouldn't understand, Naza." He started staying out later, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his usual, and returning with excuses that felt rehearsed. She noticed the phone calls he took outside, the way he would turn his face away from her in mid-conversation, his voice dropping to a murmur. When she asked questions, he would either laugh them off or grow irritated, accusing her of not trusting him. The changes weren't just in his absence, they were in his presence too. His laughter became sharper, his compliments rarer. The man who once held her hand in public now walked ahead of her, glancing back only to see if she was keeping up. And yet, whenever she felt the urge to confront him, she reminded herself of how far they had come, how much she had poured into his success. She told herself that no relationship was perfect, that this was just a phase, that he was under pressure. She swallowed her pain and focused on maintaining the home, making sure his meals were ready, his clothes ironed, his days made easier. Love, she believed, was about enduring the rough edges. But the edges were growing sharper, and she was the only one bleeding from them. Still, there were moments, fleeting but powerful, when he would pull her close, kiss her cheek, and say, "You're still my person." Those moments kept her tethered, even when the evidence around her suggested otherwise. She clung to them like a lifeline, unwilling to believe that the man she had invested so much in could be slipping away. But in the quiet of night, when his phone buzzed with messages he hid from her and his sleep was restless with half-smiles, she felt a cold truth creeping in. The man she had built up was no longer the man she had fallen in love with. And though she didn't know it yet, the next shift in their lives would not be subtle. It would walk right through their front door. It happened on a humid Tuesday afternoon. Chinaza was in the kitchen, the scent of a goosey soup filling the air, when Oena walked in with a tall, striking woman carrying a designer handbag. "Naza, meet my cousin Vanessa," he said with a broad smile, as though he were delivering good news. Vanessa extended a hand, her nails long and painted a deep red, her eyes scanning Chinaza in a quick, assessing glance before settling into a warm smile. "I'll be staying here for a while," she added lightly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Chinaza felt her stomach tighten, but forced a polite nod. She didn't know this cousin. Oena had never mentioned her before, but she told herself not to jump to conclusions. Family was family, and perhaps this was just another relative in need. From the first night, however, Vanessa's presence unsettled her. She moved around the house with the ease of someone who belonged, laughing loudly at Oena's jokes, sitting too close to him on the couch, and offering unsolicited advice about the decor. Oena seemed energized by her presence, more talkative, more engaged, but not with Chinaza. Whenever she tried to raise her discomfort, he would dismiss it with a wave of his hand. "She's blood, Naza. Stop being petty," he would say, his tone carrying a warning edge. Vanessa, for her part, was careful. She never crossed overt lines in front of Chinaza, but she lingered in ways that left her feeling like an intruder in her own home. And every time Oena defended her, Chinaza felt a small crack open wider in the foundation of their marriage. The worst moments were the private jabs, the subtle digs only Chinaza seemed to catch. A smirk when she served Oena's food. A knowing look when Oena complimented her dress. Vanessa's presence was like a shadow that stretched further every day, and Chinaza began to feel herself shrinking in her own home. The man who once reassured her now seemed to relish her discomfort, brushing off her concerns with lines that cut deeper each time. "You're overthinking this. You've always been too sensitive. And the one that stung most. I keep you because I pity you, Naza. Don't push me." That night, lying in bed while Oena and Vanessa laughed in the living room, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was the beginning of the end, or if the end had already begun without her realizing it. The tension between Chinaza and Vanessa grew quietly, like a crack in glass that slowly spiderwebs across the surface until the whole pane threatens to shatter. It began with the smallest intrusions, Vanessa forgetting to knock before entering their bedroom, offering to help Oena choose his shirts in the morning, or taking over tasks Chinaza had done for years, like packing his lunch or handling calls from his drivers. Chinaza, who had never been one to bottle things up completely, finally decided to speak. One evening, after Vanessa had retreated to the guest room, she told Oena they needed to talk. She explained that she didn't feel comfortable with how much Vanessa inserted herself into their daily life, and she suggested it might be better if she stayed somewhere else until she could get her own place. Oena listened in silence for a moment, then leaned back with a half-smile that made her skin prickle. "Naza, do you even hear yourself?" he said. "She's my cousin. She has nowhere else to go. You're making it sound like she's a threat." His tone was not defensive in the way of someone protecting a lie. It was dismissive, almost amused, as if her feelings were irrational inconveniences to him. When she pressed further, trying to explain that it wasn't just about Vanessa being there, but the way she acted around him, he cut her off sharply. "You've always been like this," he said. "Jealous, insecure, imagining things that aren't there. You should be grateful I've never let your paranoia ruin this marriage." The words hit her like a slap. Grateful? She had given up years of her life for this man, poured herself into his ambitions until there was barely anything left for herself. And now he was framing her concerns as a flaw in her character. Vanessa's smirk over dinner later that night told her everything she needed to know. The woman had overheard the argument, and she had won this round. In the days that followed, Chinaza began to doubt herself in moments she used to feel certain. She found herself apologizing to Oena, though she wasn't entirely sure what for. He would reward these apologies with a casual arm over her shoulders or a perfunctory "that's my girl," the way a teacher might pat a student for finally getting the answer right. It was during one of these reconciliations that Oena delivered the line that would echo in her mind long after she left him. "I keep you because I pity you, Naza. You've been here too long for me to just throw you away. But don't mistake that for weakness. I could replace you any time I want." He said it with such calm finality that she couldn't even find the words to reply. That night, lying in bed alone while Vanessa and Oena watched a movie in the living room, she realized something chilling. He truly believed she wouldn't leave. and part of her hated herself for knowing he was right, at least for now. It was Oena who first noticed that something in Chinaza had gone quiet. They had known each other for years through Oena, and while they were never close, there had always been a mutual respect between them. He saw her at events, at the transport office, sometimes in the market, and she had always been warm, quick to ask about his family. But now, when he greeted her, she smiled with her lips only, her eyes dimmed in a way that unsettled him. One Saturday afternoon, when Oena was outside speaking to some drivers, Oena found himself alone with her in the kitchen. She was chopping vegetables for dinner, her hands moving automatically, her gaze fixed on the cutting board. "Naza," he began gently, "are you okay?" She gave the usual automatic answer, "I'm fine." But he didn't look convinced. "You know I'm not blind, right? I see how he treats you now. And I see how she moves around here like she owns the place. You deserve better than this." Her first instinct was to defend Oena, to brush it off the way she had with others. But something in Oena's steady gaze made her pause. "It's not that simple," she said softly. "I've been here since the beginning. I've given too much to just—" She trailed off, unable to finish. He nodded, understanding, but not agreeing. "Sometimes staying isn't strength, Naza. Sometimes it's just giving someone more chances to hurt you." His words lingered long after he left that day. Later that evening, she overheard Oena speaking to Oena on the veranda. "You should take care of her," he said plainly. "Women like her are rare. She's loyal to a fault." Obena's response was a low chuckle. "Naza, please. She's too weak to go anywhere. She knows I'm the best she can do." That sentence was a dagger that twisted deeper with each repetition in her head. Weak. He had called her weak, and in the tone of someone stating an unshakable fact. That night, she avoided both men and sat alone in the bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. Shoulders slumped, eyes dull, mouth set in a thin line. It occurred to her for the first time that perhaps Oena was right. Perhaps the strength she thought she was showing by staying was actually the proof Oena needed to keep taking her for granted. And as much as she hated the idea, the seed had been planted. The sound of laughter jolted her back into the present, the wedding reception, the hum of chatter, the clinking of glasses. Oena and Vanessa were still at the head table, their heads close together as if they were the ones celebrating. Chinaza sat beside them, her back straight, her face a picture of composure, but inside, the echoes of the past roared. She could see it all now, with sharp clarity. The years of small compromises, the justifications she had clung to, the warnings she had ignored. Each memory felt like another brick in the wall that had been built around her, a wall she had once believed was a fortress, but now knew was a cage. She thought of Oena's words, of Obena's casual cruelty, of Vanessa's smirks, and she wondered how many people in the room could read the truth in her eyes. From where she sat, she could see guests whispering, their eyes darting toward her before flicking back to the spectacle of her husband leaning in close to another woman. Some of those guests knew the truth, or at least pieces of it, but others were forming their own conclusions, none of which painted her in a dignified light. And yet, she held herself still, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had become an expert at this, at hiding the fractures beneath a flawless exterior. If there was one thing Oena had taught her, it was that showing pain only made the wound deeper. So she smiled when necessary, nodded when spoken to, and let the storm rage quietly inside her chest. The music swelled, and the MC called for the couple to dance. Before she could move, Oena stood and reached for Vanessa's hand. Chinaza remained seated, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes following them as they stepped onto the dance floor. Guests clapped and cheered. Phones lifted to capture the moment, but to Chinaza it was as if the room had gone silent, the only sound the pounding of her own heart. And it was in that moment, watching them move together under the soft lights, that she knew something had shifted inside her. She didn't feel jealous. She didn't even feel angry. She felt done. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet, irreversible way a door closes when there's nothing left to say. The first weeks after the wedding were nothing like the warm, hopeful beginnings Chinaza had once imagined for herself. The morning after the ceremony, she woke in a bed that felt colder than she remembered, the space beside her already empty. From the living room came the sound of low laughter, Oena's voice interwoven with Vanessa's, the cadence too familiar to be accidental. When she emerged, Vanessa was sprawled comfortably on the sofa in satin loungewear, flipping through a glossy magazine, while Oena scrolled on his phone. "Good morning, wife," Vanessa said with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes, and Oena chuckled as though the remark was private between them. It was an unspoken but deliberate reminder that Chinaza's place in this marriage would not come with the dignity she deserved. In the days that followed, Vanessa moved through the house with even greater freedom, deciding where the furniture should be arranged, what curtains would be replaced, and even what meals were best for Oena, sometimes dismissing Chinaza's cooking in front of him. Every time Chinaza tried to draw a line, Oena dismissed her with a wave of his hand or a sigh of exaggerated patience, as though indulging the childish tantrum of a younger sibling. Their nights were no better. Often, Oena would stay up late, discussing business, with Vanessa over drinks in the living room, their low voices punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed louder than necessary. When Chinaza asked if he could spend more time alone with her as newlyweds, he frowned as if she had suggested something absurd. "She's family, Naza," he said, the familiar defense sharpening into a warning. "Stop making this into something it's not." But Chinaza wasn't imagining the subtle changes in his behavior, the way his phone calls became longer when she was out of the room, the way he started dressing with more care before leaving the house with Vanessa, even the way his cologne lingered in the air when he returned home with her late at night. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Vanessa never dropped the mask of politeness in Oena's presence. If she had been openly hostile, perhaps Chinaza could have fought back, but instead, she played the perfect houseguest, only showing her sharper edges in stolen moments when Oena wasn't looking. Chinaza's world had narrowed into a strange, quiet misery. She woke, cooked, cleaned, and tended to the home like a ghost haunting her own life. Every so often, Oena would throw her a crumb of affection, a quick kiss on the cheek, a comment about how lucky he was to have her keeping things running, but these moments were thin and hollow, lacking the warmth they once held. She began to understand that the marriage she had entered into was not a partnership, but a performance, and her role was to smile, serve, and stay silent while Vanessa continued to occupy the space beside her husband. It was not jealousy that consumed her. It was a growing realization that she was no longer seen, no longer valued, and perhaps no longer loved. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when everything came crashing into focus. Chinaza had returned from a market earlier than planned, carrying bags of fresh vegetables and meat for dinner. The house was unusually quiet when she stepped inside. No music, no clinking of glasses, no voices from the living room. She called out Oena's name, receiving no answer. As she made her way toward the bedroom, the sound of muffled laughter reached her ears, followed by the unmistakable creak of the bed. Her steps slowed, her breath catching in her throat, and when she pushed the door open, the sight before her felt like a blow to the chest. Oena lay in bed, shirtless, his arm draped over Vanessa, who was clad in nothing but a silk camisole. They froze when they saw her, but it was Vanessa who smirked first, her eyes glinting with triumph. Oena sat up slowly, not with guilt, but with the irritation of a man interrupted. "Naza, it's not what you think," he said flatly, the insult of his tone heavier than the lie itself. For a moment, Chinaza simply stood there, the grocery bag slipping from her hands and thudding against the floor. The vegetables scattered across the carpet, a painful metaphor for the years she had poured into this man, now lying carelessly in the dirt. Her first instinct was to scream, to cry, to demand an explanation, but what came instead was an eerie calm. She looked at both of them, her husband and the woman who had been eating at her table, and felt the final string snap somewhere inside her. Without a word, she turned and walked out, the sound of Vanessa's low chuckle following her like a shadow. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she couldn't stay another second in that house. Oena didn't come after her. Perhaps he thought she would cool off and return, the way she had endured every slight before. But as she walked through the rain-soaked streets, her clothes clinging to her skin, she realized something had shifted irrevocably. This wasn't a wound that could be patched over with half apologies or empty promises. It was the end, though she had not yet found the words to say it aloud. She found herself sitting on a park bench, her hair damp from the rain, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The air smelled of wet earth and distant cooking fires, the sounds of the city muted by the drizzle. That was where Oena found her. He had been passing by in his car when he noticed her familiar figure hunched over in the fading light. Pulling over, he approached slowly, crouching beside her. "Naza, what happened?" he asked gently. For a moment, she didn't answer, afraid that speaking the truth would make it more real. But when she finally lifted her eyes to meet his, something in his steady gaze unlocked the words she had been holding back. She told him everything. The years of sacrifice, the endless gaslighting, the humiliation of the wedding day, and finally, what she had seen that afternoon. He listened without interruption, his jaw tightening at certain points, his eyes darkening when she described Vanessa's smirk. When she finished, he didn't offer empty platitudes or rush to defend his friend. Instead, he said simply, "You can't go back there. Not now. Not ever." He offered her his spare room, promising it was only temporary, a place to rest and gather her strength. At first, she hesitated, wary of depending on another man so soon after breaking away, but something about Oena's quiet steadiness made her believe him. He didn't look at her with pity or hunger. He looked at her with respect, the kind she hadn't felt from Oena in years. That night, she slept in a clean, quiet room for the first time in months, her body sinking into the mattress, as if it finally recognized safety. Oena didn't hover or pry. He simply made sure she had food, space, and silence, giving her room to breathe again. In the days that followed, he became a constant, though never overbearing, presence. He drove her to the market when she needed supplies, repaired the faulty lock on the guest room door without being asked, and once, when she caught herself apologizing for being a burden, he shook his head and said, "You're not a burden, Naza. You're someone worth taking care of." The words settled into her bones like warmth after a long winter. For the first time in a long while, she began to feel something stir inside her, not romantic longing, not yet, but a faint, flickering awareness that maybe she was not as weak as Oena had always claimed. If Chinaza had any lingering doubts about Vanessa's role in her marriage, they were erased within a week of her leaving. Without hesitation, Oena installed Vanessa into the home as if she were the rightful mistress of the house, and in a twisted way, she was. It started with her redecorating. The curtains Chinaza had chosen were taken down, replaced with imported fabrics in bold colors that clashed with the walls. Family photos, especially the few that showed Oena and Chinaza together, disappeared from sight, replaced with framed portraits of Oena alone, or of him and Vanessa at various events. It was as if Chinaza's existence had been systematically erased from the home she once managed with pride. The drivers and workers who visited noticed the change, but said nothing openly. Some whispered in the yard about how Madam's cousin was running things now, while others smirked knowingly. Vanessa herself walked with an air of ownership, giving orders to the staff, deciding the menu, even choosing what Oena would wear on certain days. Her voice was everywhere, in the kitchen, in the living room, in Oena's ear, and the laughter that spilled from their conversations was loud enough to carry through the neighborhood. From a distance, Chinaza heard things. Old friends who still had ties to Oena's world would call her quietly, letting her know that Vanessa was now introducing herself as the woman of the house. There was gossip about how Vanessa had quickly adapted to her new role, hosting small gatherings for Oena's business associates, managing his social calendar, and even making decisions about the buses. Chinaza didn't ask for these updates, but she never stopped them either. They were reminders, bitter ones, of just how little value Oena had placed on their years together. Each new piece of news stung, but strangely, the pain began to take on a different shape. It was no longer the raw, bleeding hurt of betrayal. It was the cold, solid realization that she had been living in an illusion for far too long. If anything, Vanessa's open replacement of her only made it easier to keep walking away. Yet Oena seemed to believe she would return eventually. People told her he spoke casually about her absence, claiming she was cooling off and would come to her senses soon enough. His arrogance was so deeply ingrained that he couldn't imagine she might have left for good. In his mind, her years of loyalty guaranteed her eventual surrender. But what he failed to understand was that the woman who had once endured anything for his sake was changing, piece by piece. In the quiet safety of Oena's house, she was no longer the fragile, pleading wife who tiptoed around his moods. She was learning to live without him, and more importantly, she was starting to like it. The first days in Oena's house had been a haze of exhaustion and silence, but slowly, Chinaza began to wake up to herself again. Oena's approach was subtle. He didn't hover, didn't fill the space with unnecessary chatter. Instead, he offered steady, practical support. He would leave breakfast for her before heading out, sometimes with a short note. Eat well. You have a long day ahead. Or, don't forget you're stronger than you think. In the evenings, they would sit on the balcony, sharing a simple meal while the city hummed below them. She told him bits and pieces of her story, never in one sitting, but in fragments, and he listened without judgment or interruption. That quiet acceptance gave her the freedom to breathe, to think, and to plan. It was during one of those balcony dinners that Oena suggested she start something small for herself, a business that didn't require heavy capital, but could give her both income and independence. At first, the idea intimidated her. She had spent so long in Oena's shadow that the thought of doing something on her own felt almost foreign. But the more she thought about it, the more it began to feel like a lifeline. She decided to start with what she knew best, cooking. Chinaza had always been praised for her food, and in her marriage, cooking had been one of the few ways she still felt in control. With Oena's help, she began making small batches of pastries and snacks, selling them to his colleagues and neighbors. The orders grew steadily, and within a month, she had regular customers. The income wasn't much yet, but it wasn't just about the money. Each sale, each satisfied customer, was proof that she could stand on her own feet. It was a quiet victory, but one she cherished deeply. Her confidence began to show in other ways too. She started dressing better, not to impress anyone, but because it made her feel good to look in the mirror and see someone she respected. She laughed more easily, walked with her shoulders back, and spoke without the hesitation that had once marked her voice. Oena noticed the change, but never claimed credit for it. "You're just finding the version of yourself that was always there," he told her one night. And perhaps he was right. She realized she was no longer defined by the role Oena had assigned her, the quiet, pliant wife who owed her life to his pity. She was building something of her own now, and each day took her further from the woman he had believed would never leave. While Chinaza's days grew brighter, the atmosphere in Oena's house began to sour. Vanessa, once the embodiment of charm and attentiveness, started to pull away. It began subtly, declining invitations to events, spending more time on her phone, taking longer to return from errands. Oena noticed the changes, but told himself it was nothing serious. After all, he had her living under his roof. Where could she possibly go? But his complacency began to crack when she started coming home late without explanation, her makeup smudged, her perfume different from the one he had bought her. Arguments began to break out, small at first, then louder. Neighbors could hear the raised voices, and rumors began to circulate that all was not well between the so-called cousin and the man she had replaced his wife for. Vanessa's disinterest became more blatant over time. She stopped cooking, stopped helping with his business events, and started attending neighborhood gatherings on her own. It was at one of these gatherings that she met a wealthier man who lived just 2 streets away, a man with a larger house, a newer car, and the kind of flashy generosity that appealed to her. Soon, she was spending more evenings visiting friends and fewer at home. Oena tried to confront her, but each time, she deflected with sharp words or outright laughter. The dynamic between them shifted. The control he had once lorded over Chinaza was now being exercised against him, and he had no idea how to reclaim it. What stung most was the realization that the people who had once looked at him with admiration were now smirking behind his back. The same friends who had praised Vanessa's beauty were now gossiping about her absence. Even his drivers whispered about her new companion in the neighborhood. Oena found himself in a place he had never imagined. A man publicly humiliated by the very woman he had chosen over the one who had stood by him through everything. And though he would never admit it aloud, the shadow of Chinaza began to loom larger in his mind. For the first time, the possibility that she might never come back began to feel real. The end, when it came, was sudden but not unexpected. It started with an argument that lasted long into the night, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against stubborn rocks. Vanessa had returned home late again, her perfume thick in the air, her laughter still clinging to her voice as she dropped her handbag on the table. Oena had been waiting, pacing the living room, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice sharper than it had been in months. Vanessa arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into that infuriating smile she used when she wanted to remind him she owed him nothing. "Out," she said simply, walking past him toward the bedroom. He followed, the tension in his steps heavy, his mind scrambling for a way to regain the control he once wielded so easily. But every word he threw at her seemed to bounce off, as though she had already decided he no longer mattered. 2 days later, she was gone. No dramatic confrontation, no tearful farewell, just gone. Her clothes, her shoes, her makeup, all cleared from the wardrobe. In their place was an emptiness that seemed to echo through the room. Oena's first thought was that she had gone to stay with a friend after their fight, but when he called her phone, it went straight to voicemail. It was only later that he heard the truth from neighbor. Vanessa had moved in with the wealthier man she had been seeing, the one with the expensive cars and the sprawling house 2 streets away. The humiliation was sharp and public. People whispered when he passed, their voices dripping with schadenfreude. Men who had once envied him now smirked, and women who had once smiled politely now avoided his gaze, as though afraid his downfall might be contagious. The emptiness she left behind was not just physical. It was a mirror held up to Oena's own failures. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had traded loyalty for vanity, love for lust, stability for a fleeting sense of power. Vanessa had been a thrill, a trophy, a way to feed his ego, but she had never been a foundation. And now, without her, the house felt cold and strangely foreign. Nights were the worst, the silence pressed in on him, and the absence of laughter, even her mocking laughter, was like a void. For the first time, he thought of Chinaza not as the woman who had left him, but as the one who had made that house a home. And the weight of that realization was heavier than anything he had carried before. Regret did not strike Oena like lightning. It seeped in slowly, like rainwater finding cracks in a roof. At first, he tried to distract himself, throwing himself into work, surrounding himself with acquaintances who still treated him with a shred of respect, filling his evenings with meaningless outings. But no matter how far he drove or how loud the music was, he couldn't outrun the quiet moments when her face would rise unbidden in his mind. He would remember the nights Chinaza sat with him on the balcony, sharing roasted corn while he spoke about dreams he hadn't yet touched. He would recall the mornings she woke before dawn to prepare food for his workers, the way she would smooth his collar before he left the house, the quiet pride in her eyes when he came home with good news. These memories didn't just remind him of what he'd lost. They reminded him of who he had been when she believed in him, a man he could no longer recognize in the mirror. The shame was compounded by the whispers he overheard in the neighborhood. People spoke of Chinaza with respect now, often noting how much brighter she seemed since leaving. Some even hinted that she had started a small business and was doing well for herself. Each time he heard such things, the knot in his chest tightened. He told himself he could reach out to her, that he could explain himself, that maybe she would see how much he had changed, or at least how much he wanted to. But then he would remember the look on her face the day she caught him with Vanessa, the calm, final stillness in her eyes, and his courage would falter. Still, the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. He began asking mutual acquaintances about her in casual tones, careful not to sound too desperate. He learned she was still living with Oena, and though no one outright said they were together, the possibility gnawed at him. Oena had always been the steady, reliable type, the kind of man who would notice a woman's worth and hold on to it. The thought that Chinaza might be building a life with him filled Oena with a jealousy so raw it made his hands clench. Yet beneath the jealousy was fear. Fear that she might have finally found someone who could give her the love and respect he had denied her for so long. One late afternoon, unable to bear the weight of his thoughts any longer, Oena found himself driving toward Oena's neighborhood. He told himself he was only going to pass by to see for himself how she was doing, but when he parked a short distance from the gate, he realized his hands were trembling. After several minutes of staring at the house, he got out and approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. When Oena opened the gate, the look on his face was unreadable, not hostile, but not welcoming either. "Is she here?" Oena asked, his voice lower than he intended. Oena didn't answer immediately, instead calling over his shoulder. Moments later, Chinaza appeared in the doorway, dressed simply, but with a glow he didn't remember ever seeing on her before. For a moment, the sight of her robbed him of words. She looked different, not just in appearance, but in presence. There was a steadiness in her eyes, a quiet confidence that made him feel smaller than he had in years. "Naza," he began, I just wanted to talk, to say I'm sorry." She regarded him with polite detachment, as though speaking to a distant acquaintance rather than a man she had once built her life around. "There's nothing to talk about, Oena," she said softly. "We've already said everything that mattered. The rest doesn't." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it was final. He tried to explain himself, to tell her he had made mistakes, but she simply shook her head. "Some things can't be fixed," she said, before turning back into the house. As the gate closed, Oena stood there, the echo of her words settling over him like a shroud. The rejection was sharp, but what cut deeper was the realization that she hadn't spoken out of anger. She had spoken out of freedom. She no longer needed him, no longer sought his approval, and no longer carried the weight of his opinion. He walked back to his car in a daze, the sound of laughter drifting from the house behind him. And though he couldn't see who was laughing, he knew in his gut that Oena was part of it, and that the place he had once held in her life was gone for good. It was a week after that failed visit when Oena's worst fears took shape before his eyes. He had been restless ever since seeing Chinaza again, haunted by the image of her standing in Oena's doorway with that calm, unshakable gaze. He told himself he just needed one more chance, one more conversation to remind her of their shared history. But fate, or perhaps karma, had other plans. Driving through the neighborhood on his way to a client meeting, he slowed instinctively as he neared Oena Street. And there they were, Chinaza and Oena, walking side by side, their hands intertwined in an ease that spoke of more than casual affection. They weren't just walking, they were talking and laughing, the kind of laughter that comes from a place of safety and joy, the kind he had not heard from her in years. The sight rooted him to the spot, his grip tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. For a moment, he considered calling out to her, making his presence known, forcing a confrontation. But something in the way she looked at Oena stopped him. She wasn't guarded, wasn't measuring her words, wasn't shrinking herself to fit into someone else's comfort. She was fully herself, the version of Chinaza he remembered from before the shadows of their marriage fell over her. Oena looked at her the way a man does when he knows the value of what he holds, not out of ownership, but out of reverence. And that was the blow Oena couldn't brace for, the realization that Oena was giving her something he never had, a love that saw her as an equal, not a possession. The jealousy that surged through him was mixed with something darker, heavier, the bitter taste of knowing that he had handed her into another man's arms, brick by brick, choice by choice. He sat there long after they disappeared from view, the hum of the car engine drowning out the roar in his head. Memories assaulted him, her sacrifices, her loyalty, the countless times she had chosen him over herself. And he had squandered it all, not just by betraying her with Vanessa, but by convincing himself she would never leave. He had thought her love was an infinite resource, something that would refill no matter how much he drained it. Now, watching her with Oena, he understood too late that love like hers had an expiration date. And when it was gone for good. The final blow came one bright Sunday morning. Oena was leaving a meeting when he spotted them again, this time outside a cozy cafe in the city center. Chinaza was dressed in a soft blue dress that caught the sunlight, her hair pulled back elegantly, her smile warm and unguarded. Oena sat across from her, leaning forward slightly, listening intently as she spoke, his hand resting casually over hers on the table. It was such a simple scene, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Oena stood across the street unnoticed, watching the life that might have been his if he had valued her when he had the chance. She laughed at something Oena said, and the sound hit him like an echo from another lifetime, a reminder of a version of her he had killed without even realizing it. When they rose to leave, Oena instinctively reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation. Together, they walked toward the parking lot, moving in sync in a way that spoke of a partnership built on mutual respect. They passed close enough that Oena could hear snippets of their conversation, light, affectionate, unburdened by the tension that had marked every interaction between him and Chinaza in those final years. She glanced briefly in his direction, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no anger in her gaze, no lingering pain, no plea for him to understand. There was only peace, the peace of a woman who had made her choice and stood firmly in it. That was the moment he knew he had not just lost her. He had lost the right to even imagine her in his life again. As they drove away together, Oena remained frozen on the sidewalk, the city bustling around him like he didn't exist. He thought of all the chances he had been given, all the warnings he had ignored, all the moments when a single act of kindness or humility could have changed the course of their lives. But those moments were gone, and the man who now walked beside her was the man who had seen her worth from the start, the man who had stepped in when Oena's arrogance left her vulnerable. For the rest of his life, Oena would carry the image of them walking away, their hands intertwined, her laughter rising above the noise of the city. And deep down, he knew this was the ending he had written for himself the day he chose to put her in the back seat and flaunt another woman in her place. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.